Our next unit is Age of Absolutism, referring to absolute monarchs, kings and queens who had absolute total control over their nations. We will focus on a few European nations and their monarchs and see how they changed things economically, politically, socially, religiously, militarily. Fill in the notes as we go along, and you will be submitting the guided question, so that will be graded. This is what we mean by absolute monarchs, the features or characteristics of an absolute king or queen. First of all, their power cannot be challenged or checked. We have checks and balances in our political system where different branches of government can limit the power of others. In an absolute monarchy, you don't have a judiciary, meaning judges, or a legislature, or even a church that can overrule the monarch. They have total control. Second feature is the king or queen believes, or at least says, that they have a divine right to rule. In other words, their power to rule comes from God, and only God can take that power away, meaning the people can't. Third, in an absolute monarchy, the king or queen takes power away from the heads of the church, like the Pope, or the feudal lords, the nobles who control the land. The king or queen grabs that power and they hold it alone. Lastly, an absolute monarch has total power to make laws, to raise taxes, to administer justice and criminal justice system, to choose who are the officials in government, and to determine foreign policy. Foreign policy means how you relate to other countries. That can include making war. One of the biggest things that we will focus on is religion and how religion drove conflicts between European nations in this period from around the mid-1500s to the mid-1700s. The first nation that we will focus on and pay a lot of attention to religion is France. So here's the EQ for the unit. What effect might absolute control have on a country? And again, think in terms of politics, economics, religion, the military, culture. In France, you had a division between Protestants, most of whom were Calvinists. Calvinism was discussed in a previous unit. Under Calvinism, people believed that some people were predestined to be saved and others were not. And you never know. You could never know during your lifetime if you were going to be saved or not. We also discussed Catholicism. Pope heads the Catholic Church. Most of France, vast majority, was Catholic. A small percentage were Protestant, and then most of them were Calvinists. It became highly militant, meaning combative between the people who followed the Catholic Church and the Calvinists. Both wanted to convert people. This is coming after the Reformation. The Catholic Church lost people who converted to the Protestant denominations. They wanted to bring in people to replace those that they had lost. And the Protestants, the Calvinists, wanted to beef up their numbers so that they could eliminate the other side's authority in France. So that's the source for the religious wars in Europe that began in the 1500s. The name for the Protestants in France were the Huguenots. And the French kings, who had been Catholic up to that point, persecuted, oppressed the Huguenots. And it was easier to do because the Huguenots only made up about 7% of the total French population. So they were small in number. It was easy for the king to persecute them. It's much more difficult when a majority of people are trying to be oppressed. But the complication was, even though the Calvinists, the Huguenots, made up only about 7% of the total population, they made up 40 to 50% of the nobles, the people who controlled the land. So they did have, many of them did have power. So what happened is, because so many of the nobles became Huguenots, Protestants, Calvinists, that became a threat to the monarchs, to the kings in France, who had been strongly Catholic. So for roughly 30 years, you get these battles between the Catholics and the Huguenots in France. And then this guy comes along, Henry of Navarre, Henry IV. So in 1589, he became king. He was a Huguenot, but he converted to Catholicism. Why? Because he wanted to end the conflict and bring the two sides together. That's one way that a monarch can achieve peace. This is a key term that you need to know, you need to memorize. The Edict of Nantes. He issued this, and it's like a declaration. This made Catholicism the official religion of France, but importantly, it gave Huguenots, it gave the Protestants the right to worship, and it gave them full political rights. So again, this is a way to bring peace within a nation. If you are a monarch, have religious tolerance. Okay, let's make some comparisons with Spain. Spain was also, as you know, overwhelmingly Catholic. Around the same time that Henry of Navarre was king of France, Philip II became king of Spain. And he was a very militant supporter of Catholicism. He wanted to forcibly convert people to the Catholic Church, and he pushed Muslims and Jews out of Spain to make it more Catholic. So everybody had to conform to Catholic beliefs, and he gathered more power for himself. He also created alliances with other nations against, for example, the Turks, who were Muslim. Now, he tried to do this in the Netherlands as well. He tried to go there to convert more people to Catholicism. But in the Netherlands, there were no powerful nobles who were able to resist him. So one of the keys here, if you're a monarch, is to be able to exercise control over nobles. In addition to Islam and trying to push Judaism out, he also tried to push out any Protestants, so the Calvinists. So those Calvinists in the Netherlands rebelled, and they set up their own independent state. And eventually there was a truce. Now when Philip's reign as king ended, just before the year 1600, Spain became the most powerful, most populous empire in the world. Populous meaning having the most people with all their colonies. But the flip side is, and this is something that you would want to use as an example for the EQ, when he left as king, the empire was bankrupt, didn't have any money, even with all that gold and silver that they had collected. Now, how did that happen? Well, he spent so much money on wars, and they had built up the greatest navy in the world, the Spanish Armada. You can bring in all the money you want, but if you're spending more than you're bringing in, you're going to go bankrupt. And that's what he did to Spain. Now, the important effect of that is that shifted power away from Spain to England, whom he had tried to conquer and convert them to Catholicism. Let's talk about England. Let's talk about England. The woman on the right is Elizabeth I, who was Queen of England. She was one of the children of Henry VIII, the guy we talked about before, the king who couldn't find a wife who could produce a son for him that was fit to rule. So she was from the Tudor family. Her sister Mary, Bloody Mary, had been the one that forced everybody or tried to force everybody in England to become Catholic. Then after she was executed, Elizabeth I, her sister, rose to the throne, and she practiced religious tolerance. So to keep the peace, she allowed both Protestants and Catholics to have certain rights. So she repealed those laws that favored Catholics and penalized Protestants. She wanted to balance things out. Because when you do that, that prevents, or it doesn't prevent, but it makes it less likely for there to be rebellion against your authority. During her time as Queen, Parliament, the legislature in England, passed the Act of Supremacy, and what that did is it made Elizabeth not only the only leader of government, but also the head of the Church of England, which had been created under her dad, Henry VIII. So she was the leader of both church and state. And again, to try and keep the peace, to keep things as calm as possible, she allowed the Protestants and the Catholics to have certain rights, including the ability to practice their forms of Christianity. Biggest thing, her biggest concern was keeping the English loyal to England above all else. Foreign policy, the way that she dealt with other countries. First of all, she didn't want to end up like Philip II. So she tried to avoid war because that could bankrupt the country and she would be out of power. She was very intelligent. So she would try to balance power between the different rival nations, particularly Spain and France. Whichever of those two countries was weak at any given time, she would ally England with them to counterbalance the more powerful one. So like, let's say France was most powerful at one time, she would have England become allied with Spain so that they could prevent France from becoming too powerful. Here's an example. When Philip II of Spain went into the Netherlands to defeat the Calvinists and spread Catholicism, Elizabeth made sure that England supported the Protestants, the Calvinists in the Netherlands, to counterbalance Philip II in Spain. She also encouraged pirates to attack the Spanish Armada. That's why she knighted Francis Drake, one of the sailors, explorers for England. She also avoided marriage. She was called the Virgin Queen, and she ruled for a long time because she wanted to just be focused on maintaining her power. And she encouraged mercantilism. She wanted England to export more than it imported. She also granted charters. That means the right to exist for joint stock companies. So people could invest in a startup company. And then once that company started making a profit, they would get paid back in what are called dividends. So what that all leads to is Queen Elizabeth stabilized England. And England becomes the most powerful Protestant country in Europe. Spain was the most powerful Catholic country. And those two countries come into conflict with each other because Elizabeth beheaded her first cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, She was the next in line for the throne, so Elizabeth was safeguarding her throne. Here's the problem. Philip II, the King of Spain, had been in love with Mary, Queen of Scots. And so he resolved, after his love was beheaded, to attack England and try to remove Elizabeth from power. And the other effect that would have is he could try to convert England to becoming a Catholic country. He was also upset over the fact that Queen Elizabeth had knighted Francis Drake, the ship captain, leader of the English Navy, who had led attacks on the Spanish fleet. So you can see the size of Spain's armada. That was a lot of ships at that time. That would still be a lot of ships today. Even though the British fleet was outnumbered, they managed to defeat the Spanish armada led by Francis Drake. And that set up for over 2 centuries England having the most powerful navy in the world. And they used that to build the greatest empire over that time period across the globe. So as a result of that, England becomes the foremost Protestant country in Europe. So with Queen Elizabeth, the crown, the king or the queen of England, has more power than Parliament. But we're going to see that change when we start talking about the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. So big changes are on the way after this. Queen Elizabeth dies in 1603, and that leads to some important changes within England. Answer the chapter 18 lesson 2 questions now, and you're going to turn that in by the end of class. So stay focused on that, please.